So I'm sure you've seen the Real ID. Now, most people think that these Real IDs are just a rebranded driver's license or identification card with a star on it for some strange reason. But my question is, why would we need to rebrand our identification cards in the first place? Unless there was some significant changes being made. And that question sent me down a rabbit hole of some very interesting hidden in plain sight agendas regarding this federal push for Real IDs. But I think a good place to start would be, what is a Real ID? The first thing to note is that Real IDs are not a new thing. The Real ID Act is a federal law passed by George W. Bush in 2005 in response to 9/11 as some sort of anti-terrorism measure. But what's interesting to note is that none of the hijackers actually used fake identities to board the planes that they were hijacking. When you really look at it, it seems like this national security threat was used as sort of an excuse to implement these Real IDs. And when the law was passed, trying to get individual states to mandate it and implement it wasn't an easy task either. As a matter of fact, in 2007, 17 states refused participation in the Real ID system, and 10 others enacted solutions opposing it. After multiple extensions of this enforcement date over the years due to lack of compliance from individual states, May 7th, 2025 began the date where the TSA began phased enforcement of Real ID for domestic flights and entering government buildings. Which isn't to say that you actually need a Real ID to travel. There are plenty of other documents that you can use to identify yourself and get on a commercial flight. On the Real ID Act of 2005, under the definition titled Official Purpose, it states, the term official purpose includes but is not limited to accessing federal facilities, boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft, entering nuclear power plants, which it doesn't sound too bad, but what I'm paying attention to is the last part of this sentence, which says, quote, and any other purposes the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security shall determine. So this ambiguous, amorphous rule would allow any secretary of the DHS that now comes in, now it's Kristi Noem, but eventually it could be anyone else, to come in and based on the circumstance, make amendments to what this Real ID is required for. The reason this concerns people is, let's say there's some sort of national or global emergency or some false flag pandemic or something, and the government decides, hey, some of you are putting the nation at risk, or some of you are putting a certain group of vulnerable people at risk, and use that as an excuse, the circumstance as an excuse, to remove some of our rights. What rights, are you asking? Well, not being able to enter government buildings or fly on a plane could potentially turn into restrictions for medical care access, owning a gun, getting married, getting into colleges, you name it. So you may be asking yourself, but how is this any different from the forms of identification that I'm already familiar with? Like, don't I give up the same data or rights when I apply to get a passport or something? The answer is surprisingly no. Getting a Real ID requires you to, 1, show up at the DMV, 2, take a picture for your ID per usual, but the third part is kind of interesting. They need your fingerprint, which is then stored on a database along with copies of the documents you need to bring in order to register for this Real ID. So not only is a Real ID like a interstate domestic flight passport that you need to use, but also it tracks your biometric data along with the documents, copies of them that you have to bring to register, stores them on this database, and it also, with this rule about the DHS secretary being able to make changes to what the ID is required for depending on the circumstance, has a kill switch on your rights. But of course, this is the federal government we're talking about. They want as much surveillance on their citizens as possible. So it's not going to stop there. To explain this next part, here's a clip from an interview that Brett Weinstein had with Twila Brace, who is a part of the Citizens Council for Health Freedom, that explains the potential next stage for this Real ID program.
They look at this card in their hand and they just say, well, this is just a state driver's license with a star, but you have to see where it's going to go. So the state DMVs have testified in their organization. It's called the American the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA. So AMVA testified in December of 2023 to Congress of their plan to digitize the Real ID, put it on our phones, and have remote real-time access to it. And so that means that every time you pulled that thing out, you would ping the government. And so what we're really building here is the potential or the framework or the foundation for a social credit system, which we saw happening during COVID in China.
If this document, if this Real ID becomes digitized, that means the infrastructure is already in place to implement a sort of digital ID social credit system, kind of similar to what China's got going on right now. Then the possibilities for abuse are basically endless. Travel restrictions, purchase restrictions, and punishments for certain purchases, punishments for your carbon footprint if it's too high, and with the rise of digital transactions, Apple Pay, online banking, central bank digital currencies, the risk of debanking is very high if you say or do the wrong thing. This is like an authoritarian 1984 kill switch. I mean, that's basically what they're building here. That's what this is, disguised as a rebranded identification card. And you may be asking yourself, is there anything I can do about this? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. You can still protect yourself. You can still do something about this. Although certain states do require you to get a Real ID, most states will allow you to opt out. So if you're renewing your license or you're getting a new ID, let them know you want a standard ID instead of a Real ID. If you're concerned about flying out anywhere, just know you don't need a Real ID to travel. You can use different documents to identify yourself and get on a plane. Also, if you want to learn more about this and what to do if you already have a Real ID, I'll link below the interview with Twila Brace, along with a page that has a lot more information about this topic. But with that being said, stay vigilant and have a wonderful day.